The morning sun, a pale gold disk peeking over the horizon, cast a warm, buttery glow upon the quaint breakfast nook. The air was filled with the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee and toasted bread, a symphony of kitchen sounds that normally signified a peaceful start to the day. But today, a subtle tension hung in the air, a discordant note in the otherwise harmonious scene. Jenna, her face framed by a cascade of auburn hair, barely looked up from her phone, her fingers scrolling with a frantic energy that belied the calm facade she projected. Her eyes, usually sparkling with a warm, loving light, held a distant, almost haunted gleam as they lingered on a particular message, a flicker of guilt flitting across her features. Her carefully chosen, floral summer dress couldn't disguise the subtle tremor in her hands, betraying the turmoil churning within her. Across from her, Andy, her husband, a man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, was cheerfully pouring Chloe, their daughter, a bowl of cereal. His face, etched with the lines of love and worry, held a hopeful optimism that seemed woefully out of sync with the atmosphere. He was a beacon of normalcy in a storm brewing just beneath the surface. "Don't forget, darling," he said, his voice warm and reassuring, "tonight's Chloe's birthday dinner. I booked that Italian place you love." His words were a gentle reminder of the life they shared, of the moments of joy and normalcy he desperately wanted to hold on to. Chloe, a whirlwind of 8-year-old energy, bounced in her chair, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Can we have that chocolate cake with the rainbow sprinkles, Daddy?" she asked, her voice brimming with childlike enthusiasm. Her bright smile, her complete innocence, was a stark contrast to the hidden complexities of the adults around her. It was a fragile bubble of happiness that Andy was fiercely determined to protect. Jenna, tearing her gaze away from her phone, forced a smile. "Of course, sweetheart. We'll have the biggest, most delicious cake ever." Her voice was strained, a mere whisper of the warmth it usually held. Her mind, however, was miles away, caught in the web of her secret life. The message she had just read, a simple "meet me at the usual place," from Richard, her boss and the clandestine source of her secret happiness, a forbidden thrill that had been slowly gnawing at the foundation of her life. Richard, a man of power and charisma, had weaved himself into her life like a seductive spider, spinning a web of whispered promises and stolen moments. He had filled a void she hadn't even known existed, kindling a forbidden fire within her heart. A fire that was slowly consuming her, threatening to burn down the life she had carefully built with Andy. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed abnormally loud, each second a reminder of the choices Jenna faced. The clock was a constant reminder, a countdown to a collision between her two worlds, her secret life and the one she pretended to cherish. Andy, sensing the shift in Jenna's demeanor, tried to bridge the gap, to coax her back into the present. "Ready for work, love?" he asked, his voice tinged with a hint of concern. "I'll take Chloe to school. We can pick up the cake on the way back." Jenna, with a forced smile and a slight tremor in her voice, responded, "Yes, I have a lot to do at the office today. A big presentation for the new client." Her words were carefully chosen, a veil over the turmoil within. The office was her other refuge, a place where she could escape the constraints of her marriage, where she could momentarily forget the promises she had made and the life she was slowly betraying. As Jenna rose from her chair, her eyes inadvertently met Chloe's. The bright, trusting gaze of her child pierced through her carefully constructed facade. A wave of guilt washed over her, a cold, biting reminder of the fragility of familial bonds, the weight of her betrayal. The thought of the evening's celebration, a night meant to symbolize Chloe's happiness and innocence, seemed tainted with a bitter irony. Jenna's gaze then fell on a small, intricately carved wooden box resting on the kitchen counter. It was a gift from Andy, a memento from their honeymoon in Italy. It reminded her of the warmth and love they shared, a life she was slowly chipping away at. The box, a symbol of their shared past, seemed to mock her present predicament, a silent accusation in the otherwise ordinary kitchen. Stepping out the door, Jenna's phone vibrated in her pocket. It was a text from Richard, a reminder of their meeting. The world outside the cozy kitchen was a different realm, a world where secrets were whispered and desires were indulged. It was a world she was slowly becoming accustomed to, a world that was slowly consuming her. The morning sun, once a symbol of hope and renewal, seemed to cast a dark shadow upon her path, a reflection of the choices she had made and the consequences that were rapidly approaching. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of the corporate tower, casting long, golden shadows across the polished marble floors. Jenna, her tailored skirt crisply creased and her dark hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail, navigated the bustling office with an air of practiced efficiency. She was a woman who knew her way around the corporate world, a rising star in the advertising firm where she'd spent the last 5 years meticulously climbing the ladder. Yet, beneath the polished exterior, a simmering tension resided, a secret that she guarded closely. Her usual composed demeanor held a subtle edge today, a hint of anticipation that flickered in her eyes every time she glanced at the clock. The air crackled with unspoken desires, a secret rendezvous that was about to unfold. Her destination, Richard's office, a sanctuary of sleek mahogany and understated luxury. Richard, her boss, the man who held her career in his hands, and the object of her forbidden passion. Jenna knocked lightly on the heavy oak door, a soft sound that seemed to echo the uncertainty that thrummed beneath her carefully constructed facade. Richard's deep baritone voice, husky and laced with a hint of playful command, answered, "Come in, Jenna." The office was a study in masculine power, filled with expensive art, leather-bound books, and the scent of expensive cologne that lingered in the air. Richard, a man with steely eyes and a charming smile that could disarm even the most discerning woman, stood by the window, the cityscape stretching out before them like a vast, shimmering canvas. "You look stunning today, Jenna," Richard purred, his words laced with a sensual undertone that made her skin prickle. Jenna offered him a smile, a subtle curve of her lips that hid the turmoil brewing within her. "Thank you, Richard," she replied, her voice a soft counterpoint to his commanding tone. Their conversation was a carefully choreographed dance of veiled innuendos and shared glances, a silent acknowledgement of the forbidden connection that bound them. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a shared secret that felt both thrilling and dangerous. "We need to get out of here," Richard said, his voice dropping to a low murmur, his eyes holding hers with a potent intensity. "There's a place I know, a hotel just a few blocks away. We can steal a few hours, just us." Jenna's heart quickened at his words, the thrill of transgression coursing through her veins. She nodded, her agreement unspoken but evident in the way her eyes met his, a spark of forbidden desire igniting between them. The hotel room was a cocoon of plush luxury, a haven from the sterile world of the corporate tower. The scent of expensive linens and subtle jasmine filled the air, a sensual backdrop to their clandestine affair. Jenna shed her tailored clothes, revealing a body that was both sleek and sensual, her skin shimmering in the muted lamplight. Richard moved towards her, his touch gentle yet possessive. Their lovemaking was a passionate dance, a symphony of tangled limbs and whispered breaths. Jenna lost herself in his touch, her inhibitions melting away in the intoxicating heat of his embrace. She found a temporary release from the pressures of her life, the relentless demands of her career and the stifling expectations of her marriage. In the midst of their climax, a jarring discordance shattered the fragile bubble of their stolen moment. Jenna's phone buzzed insistently, a relentless vibration that echoed through the room, a stark reminder of the world they were temporarily escaping. The insistent buzzing intensified, a persistent intrusion into their private sanctuary. Jenna ignored it, her senses still reeling from the aftermath of their passion. She clung to Richard, her body trembling, lost in the afterglow of their shared intimacy. The buzzing continued, a relentless reminder of the outside world, a world that she desperately wanted to escape. But the phone was not going to be silenced. It was a constant reminder that their clandestine affair was a fragile bubble, a secret that could shatter at any moment. The constant buzzing was a harbinger of the storm that was brewing, a storm that was about to disrupt their carefully constructed world. The relentless buzzing of the phone was a ticking time bomb, a prelude to the unraveling of their shared secret, a secret that was destined to shatter their carefully constructed reality. The phone was not just a nuisance, it was a symbol of the looming consequences of their actions, the inevitable confrontation with the world they were desperately trying to escape. And as the buzzing continued, a sense of unease began to settle over Jenna, a premonition of the chaos that was about to engulf them. The fragile piece of their stolen moment was crumbling, and the consequences of their actions were about to come crashing down. The scent of expensive cologne, a musky blend of sandalwood and amber, lingered in the air, a stark contrast to the faint, floral perfume clinging to the silk sheets. Jenna, her breath still coming in ragged gasps, lay tangled in the crisp white fabric, her body flushed and her hair a wild halo around her face. Richard, her boss, her lover, lay beside her, his dark eyes still reflecting the afterglow of their illicit encounter. The afternoon sun slanted through the sheer curtains, casting long, warm shadows across the plush carpet of the hotel suite. A jarring ring pierced the lingering intimacy, a discordant note in the symphony of their forbidden passion. Jenna's eyes snapped open, her heart skipping a beat. She had ignored the relentless calls for the past hour, lost in the intoxicating haze of transgression. Now, the insistent ringing seemed to vibrate through her very bones, a harbinger of something ominous. Richard, his features momentarily clouded with annoyance, reached out a hand to the bedside table where the phone lay buzzing. "Ignore it," he murmured, his voice husky with the remnants of their coupling. But Jenna was already reaching for the phone, a cold dread tightening in her chest. She knew, instinctively, that this call was different. Something about its insistent urgency, the way it vibrated with a raw, unfiltered fear, sent shivers down her spine. "Hello?" she answered, her voice trembling slightly. "Mrs. Sharma?" The voice on the other end was clipped, devoid of warmth. "This is Dr. Evans from St. Mary's Hospital. We have some unfortunate news regarding your husband and daughter. They were involved in a hit-and-run accident earlier this afternoon." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Jenna's breath hitched in her throat, a strangled gasp that echoed in the silence of the hotel room. Richard's hand, still reaching for her, froze mid-air. "Andy, Chloe," she whispered, the words barely audible. Her mind raced, desperately trying to grasp the gravity of the words. Andy, her husband, her rock, the man who had loved her unconditionally, despite her flaws. Chloe, her sunshine, her vibrant, laughter-filled daughter, whose bright eyes held the promise of 1,000 tomorrows. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Davies," Dr. Evans's voice continued, his tone carefully measured, yet laced with a sorrow that reached through the phone lines. They were both brought in with severe injuries. Sadly, despite our best efforts, they didn't survive." The words, sharp and unforgiving, shattered the fragile bubble of Jenna's world. A wave of nausea washed over her, threatening to drown her in a sea of grief and disbelief. Richard's hand finally found her arm, his touch a clumsy attempt at comfort. But his presence, the reminder of their betrayal, only fueled the flames of her anguish. I need to get to the hospital," she managed to say, her voice a mere whisper, the words barely escaping her lips. "Of course, Mrs. Davies." "We're here," Dr. Evans replied, his voice tinged with compassion. "Please come as soon as you can." Jenna hung up, her fingers trembling as she clutched the phone. The plush hotel room, once a sanctuary of forbidden pleasure, now felt like a suffocating cage. The sun, once a symbol of warmth and vitality, seemed to cast a cruel, mocking light on her illicit affair. She stumbled out of bed, her legs shaky, her vision blurry. Richard's voice, a low murmur of concern, followed her. "Jenna, what's wrong?" But she barely registered his words. Her mind was a whirlwind of frantic thoughts, images of Andy's warm smile, Chloe's infectious giggle flashing before her eyes. The weight of her betrayal, of her choices, crashed down upon her with the force of a tidal wave. How could she have been so blind, so selfish? She didn't answer Richard. She didn't need to. Her eyes, filled with a raw, unfiltered agony, spoke volumes. She needed to get to Andy and Chloe, to hold them one last time, even if it was just their lifeless bodies. To beg for forgiveness, to plead for a second chance, even though she knew it was lost. With a desperate surge of energy, she grabbed her purse and rushed out of the room, leaving Richard behind, his words and his touch fading into the background noise of her shattering life. The hotel lobby, with its polished marble floors and extravagant chandeliers, seemed to mock her with its opulent indifference. The outside world, bathed in the cruel light of a late afternoon sun, stretched before her, a cruel reminder of the life she had taken for granted. A life that was now irrevocably gone. The cab ride to the hospital felt like an eternity. Every passing moment was an unbearable agonizing wait, a countdown to the inevitable confrontation with her grief, with the reality of her loss. And as the cab pulled up to the emergency entrance of St. Mary's, Jenna knew that her life, her world, would never be the same. The hospital, a beacon of hope for so many, was now the scene of her ultimate despair. The sterile white walls of the hospital seemed to amplify the deafening silence that pressed down on Jenna. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the backdrop of her own ragged breaths. A suffocating wave of nausea washed over her, threatening to drown her in a sea of regret. The air hung heavy with the scent of antiseptic and sorrow, a stark contrast to the vibrant, joyful atmosphere she had imagined this day would hold. She stood there, a fragile figure amidst the clinical coldness, her gaze fixed on the two shrouded forms lying on adjacent beds. Andy, her husband, his face serene in death, a faint smile playing on his lips as if a memory of Chloe's laughter had just touched him. And Chloe, her darling daughter, her vibrant spirit extinguished, her small body still and quiet. Tears, hot and relentless, streamed down Jenna's face, blurring her vision. Each sob ripped through her, a raw and painful expression of the grief that clawed at her insides. Her wails echoed in the small room, a symphony of despair that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the hospital. She sank to her knees, the cold, unforgiving floor offering no comfort. Her body convulsed with the agony of her loss, until finally, her strength gave way, and she slumped into unconsciousness. When Jenna awoke, the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room pierced through the haze of her mind. Groggily, she tried to sit up, her head spinning, her muscles protesting the abrupt movement. A sharp pain lanced through her temple, a constant reminder of the nightmare she was trapped in. Two uniformed officers, their expressions grave, stood beside her bed. "Mrs. Davies?" one of them asked, his voice a low murmur that cut through the silence. "We need to inform you regarding the accident that took the lives of your husband and daughter." Jenna's breath hitched. Accident. The word felt like a cruel twist of the knife in her already shattered heart. "Hit and run," the officer continued, his voice laced with a hint of regret. They were crossing the street near the bakery, picking up Chloe's birthday cake, when they were struck by a vehicle that didn't stop. The image of Chloe's bright smile, her anticipation for the chocolate cake they were bringing home, flooded Jenna's mind. The joy, the laughter, the simple, perfect normalcy of that morning, now a cruel memory, a phantom limb of happiness that she could never touch again. Then, like a shard of glass piercing through the fog of grief, an image flashed before her eyes. It was the chaotic scene of their breakfast table earlier that day. Andy, his face alight with fatherly love, was telling Chloe about her birthday plans, while she, Jenna, was hunched over her phone, texting Richard. The man who had been the cause of so many stolen moments, so many whispered promises in the shadows. The guilt, like a venomous serpent, coiled around her heart, squeezing the breath from her lungs. The warmth of the sunshine streaming through the kitchen window, the aroma of coffee and toast, the laughter of her family, all of it felt like a lifetime ago. She had been so consumed with her secret, so blinded by Richard's allure, that she had failed to appreciate the simple beauty of her life. The police officer's words were a blur, their questions a distant echo in the cavern of her grief. Her mind replayed the events of that morning, the casual ease with which she dismissed Andy and Chloe's excited chatter, her indifference to their joy. She had been so wrapped up in her own world of deceit, her own selfish desires, that she hadn't truly seen them, hadn't really listened to them. The realization struck her with the force of a tidal wave. Her affair, her lies, her carelessness, it was all a contributing factor to this tragedy. She had let her ambition, her craving for something more, overshadow the most precious gifts life had given her. The guilt, previously a gnawing worm, now roared like a lion within her. Andy, her kind, gentle husband, who had always loved her unconditionally, even when she was drifting away. Chloe, her sweet, innocent daughter, whose trusting eyes had always held a mirror to her own soul. They were gone, victims of her negligence, her selfish choices. She had been so blinded by the allure of Richard's attention, the intoxicating thrill of forbidden love, that she had neglected the very foundations of her happiness. Now, those foundations were shattered, reduced to dust by the reckless actions of a hit-and-run driver, a driver whose actions were a chilling reflection of her own thoughtless behavior. Jenna's eyes, swollen and red, stared blankly at the sterile white ceiling of the hospital room. Her life, once filled with the promise of a future, now lay in ruins, a desolate landscape of grief and regret. The weight of her actions, the terrible cost of her choices, crushed her spirit. The police officer's questions faded into the background, irrelevant whispers in the face of her overwhelming remorse. Her world had been shattered, and in the fragments of her broken life, the face of her husband and daughter haunted her, a constant reminder of the love she had carelessly lost. The road ahead, she knew, would be long and arduous, a path paved with the stones of her own sorrow. The scent of lilies, heavy and cloying, still lingered in the air, a constant reminder of the void left by Andy and Chloe. A week had passed since the tragic accident, a week since Jenna's world had shattered into a million jagged pieces. Her once vibrant home, filled with laughter and the joyous chaos of a family, now felt like a tomb, draped in a suffocating silence. Jenna, her eyes hollow and her face etched with a grief that seemed to consume her very being, sat on the worn floral sofa, a fragile porcelain doll in a storm. Richard, her boss, her lover, her current source of both comfort and revulsion, sat beside her, his hand resting gently on her arm. His touch, once a source of forbidden thrill, now felt like a violation. Yet, in her fractured state, she clung to it, a drowning woman grasping at a flimsy raft. His presence was a constant reminder of the betrayal, the tangled web of deceit that had led to this abyss. The house, usually bathed in sunlight, was draped in a perpetual twilight, the heavy curtains drawn against the outside world. It was a refuge, a prison, a testament to her shattered life. Richard, sensing her silent turmoil, leaned closer, his voice a soothing balm in the oppressive silence. "Jenna, my love. You need to eat. You haven't touched a thing all day." His words, intended to be comforting, scraped against the raw edges of her sorrow. He spoke of love, but his eyes held a calculating gleam, a possessive glint that chilled her to the bone. She knew it was wrong, this reliance on the man who was both her solace and her tormentor. He was the architect of her pain, yet, in her desolate state, she found herself drawn to his deceptive comfort. The days blurred into a melancholic haze. Richard was a persistent presence, a shadow that followed her through the wreckage of her life. He showered her with attention, with gestures of caring, with reassurances that were hollow and insincere. He held her when she cried, whispered promises of healing, and in the fragile moments of vulnerability, their grief morphed into a twisted solace, leading to an intimacy born out of pain and desperation. It was a transgression, a betrayal of Andy and Chloe's memory. Jenna's heart ached with a mixture of guilt and a self-loathing that consumed her. Yet, in the twisted logic of her sorrow, she found a temporary respite in Richard's arms. Driven by a desperate need to reclaim a semblance of normalcy, to escape the suffocating grip of her grief, Jenna decided to return to work. The office, once a place of ambition and purpose, now felt alien, a sterile environment that offered no comfort. She hoped that immersing herself in her work would help her heal, to somehow move on from the tragedy that had claimed her family. An impulse, a flicker of hope born out of a desire to see Richard, a desire she couldn't quite decipher, led her to his office. She wanted to surprise him, to share a small, insignificant moment of connection. However, as she stood outside his door, the muffled sounds of a conversation drifted through the closed panel. Her blood ran cold. The words, clear and distinct, pierced through her already fractured heart. Richard's voice, tinged with a hint of smug satisfaction. "Yes, it's all taken care of. The payment to the driver, the officers, everything is settled." A chilling silence followed, then Richard's assistant, his voice devoid of any empathy, continued, "Very clever, sir. No loose ends." A cruel, almost imperceptible, hint of amusement crept into Richard's voice. "Finally, Jenna is mine. The burden between us, gone." Jenna's breath hitched in her throat. The hatred, simmering beneath the surface, erupted into a raging inferno. The words echoed in her mind, a symphony of betrayal and cruelty. Richard, her lover, her tormentor, had orchestrated the accident that robbed her of her family. The comfort, the solace, the twisted intimacy, it was all a sickening charade, a meticulously crafted web of deception. Jenna stumbled back into her office, her body trembling, her eyes burning with a furious, consuming hatred. The fragile facade of healing shattered, replaced by a steely determination. Richard was no longer a source of comfort, but the embodiment of her pain, the architect of her devastation. His words, his actions, fueled a fire within her, a fire that promised retribution. The world around her faded, a blurry canvas of beige walls and flickering fluorescent lights. Her mind, once shrouded in grief, was now a battleground of vengeful thoughts. Richard was her target, her enemy. And she would make him pay. The late afternoon sun cast long, skeletal shadows across the bustling city streets as Jenna stepped out of the imposing glass and steel edifice that housed Richard's company. The air, thick with the exhaust fumes of countless vehicles, held a chill that seeped into her bones, despite the late summer heat. Her heart, however, burned with a different kind of cold, a frigid fire fueled by rage and grief. Inside, the sterile environment of Richard's office, the man who was both her boss and her lover, had echoed with the chilling revelation of his role in the tragedy that had shattered her life. The carefully constructed facade of their affair, a twisted comfort in her grief, had crumbled. Andy, her loving husband, and Chloe, her vibrant, sunshine-filled daughter, both gone, victims of a hit-and-run orchestrated by the very man who held her hand and whispered empty words of solace. Now, Jenna was architecting her own revenge. A plan, born from the ashes of her shattered world, where she would weave a web of deception, playing the role of the heartbroken but healing lover. Day after day, she would feign affection for Richard, the man who had coldly extinguished her family's light, all the while meticulously tightening the noose around his neck. She walked with a purpose, her high heels clicking sharply against the pavement, each step a beat in the symphony of her vengeance. Her normally vibrant auburn hair, now streaked with the silver of premature aging and constant worry, was pulled back in a severe ponytail, framing a face etched with a stoicism that belied the turmoil within. Her eyes, once sparkling with joy, now held a glacial coldness, reflecting the deep chasm of pain that resided in her soul. Her destination, the Sweet Surrender Bakery, a quaint little shop nestled a few blocks away from the office. It was a place of comforting nostalgia, a place where she and Chloe had shared countless moments of sugary bliss. Chloe, with her infectious laughter and her love for rainbow sprinkles. A lump formed in Jenna's throat, a painful reminder of her irreplaceable loss. Entering the bakery, the aroma of freshly baked bread and sweet confections filled her senses. The warmth of the space, the cheerful chatter of customers, it all felt like a cruel mockery of her broken reality. She ordered a large chocolate cake, its surface generously adorned with the vibrant rainbow sprinkles that Chloe had adored. As the baker carefully placed the cake in a box, Jenna's gaze fell on the framed photograph on the wall, a sun-drenched image of the park where Andy and Chloe had met their tragic end. The tears, held back for so long, finally spilled over. They flowed freely, hot and heavy, as she stared at the spot where her family's laughter had once echoed. The memory of the horrifying screech of tires, the sickening impact, the shattering of glass, the screams that echoed in her nightmares. Her family, snatched away in a blink, replaced by a haunting emptiness that gnawed at her soul. Jenna clutched the box containing the cake, its sweetness now a perverse reminder of the bitter reality of her existence. As she walked away from the bakery, towards the scene of the tragedy, she felt a surge of determination. She would not let Richard escape justice. Her pain, her loss, it would fuel her actions. She would become the harbinger of his downfall, a cruel irony, considering their shared past. The park was deserted, the playground eerily silent. The vibrant hues of the flowers that once graced the landscape now seemed muted, a reflection of the darkness that had settled upon her life. Jenna stood at the edge of the grassy expanse, the spot where it all happened. Each blade of grass seemed to whisper of the tragedy, each swaying tree a silent witness to her shattered dreams. In the deepening twilight, Jenna's resolve solidified. She would play the part, she would lure him into a false sense of security, until the moment of reckoning arrived. She would become the seductress of his demise, the architect of his downfall. She would ensure that Richard, the man who had shattered her world, would pay for his crimes. The cake, a bittersweet symbol of her loss and her plan, was tucked firmly under her arm. It was a reminder of the innocence that had been stolen, a silent promise of the retribution that would soon follow. As darkness enveloped the park, she stood tall, a silhouette against the fading light, her eyes glinting with a chilling determination. The game had begun, and Jenna, the heartbroken widow, was ready to play. Her heart, broken beyond repair, ached with a cold rage that would not be extinguished until Richard was brought to justice. The city lights twinkled in the distance, oblivious to the silent storm brewing within her. The streets, that had once held echoes of her happy family, now held the promise of a cold and calculated revenge. The fluorescent lights of the office hummed, casting a sterile glow over the hastily decorated space. Balloons and vibrant hues of red and gold bobbed precariously, their cheerful colors clashing with the undercurrent of simmering vengeance that hung in the air. Jenna, her face painted with a smile as artificial as the decorations, flitted about, her movements a strange blend of nervous energy and practiced charm. Richard, the oblivious target of her elaborate charade, chuckled at a joke from one of his colleagues, his eyes crinkling at the corners, utterly unaware of the carefully woven web of deceit surrounding him. Jenna, her heart a cold knot of simmering fury, watched him. Richard, the man who had shattered her world, who had left her with nothing but a hollow ache and a thirst for retribution. For months, she had meticulously crafted this elaborate facade, pretending to be swept off her feet by his charm, his careless laughter, the very things that had once held so much allure, now felt like daggers twisting in her soul. But now, the time for pretense was over. "Richard, darling," she purred, her voice a silken whisper that belied the darkness within. She sauntered towards him, her body swaying with practiced grace, her eyes, usually warm and inviting, were now cold and calculating. "There's a little surprise waiting for you at my place. A much bigger one than this." She leaned in, her breath ghosting over his ear, a flirtatious smile playing on her lips. The air crackled with a tension that was almost palpable. Richard, completely captivated by the sudden shift in Jenna's demeanor, a spark of excitement ignited in his eyes. He was intrigued by her sudden, unexpected boldness. He readily accepted her invitation, a foolish grin spreading across his face. Later that evening, under the cloak of a darkening sky, Richard arrived at Jenna's doorstep. A gasp escaped his lips as the door swung open, revealing Jenna in a crimson lingerie that seemed to absorb the fading daylight. Her hair, normally neatly styled, cascaded around her shoulders in soft waves, framing a face that was both seductive and menacing. Their lips met in a passionate kiss, a dance of lust and desire that masked the sinister intentions that simmered beneath the surface. Jenna led him through the dimly lit house, her hand gently guiding him towards the kitchen, where a bottle of ruby-red wine awaited. The air was thick with the scent of roses and a subtle, almost imperceptible, metallic tang. With a flirtatious gesture, Jenna led him towards the master bedroom. In the matrimonial bedroom, once filled with the echoes of Andy laughter, Andy love, Jenna and Richard shared a final, lustful kiss. But as their bodies intertwined, a strange stillness settled over Richard. His eyes glazed over, his body slowly losing its strength, his consciousness fading. The smell of gasoline, harsh and acrid, jolted him awake. His eyes snapped open, met with a stark realization of his predicament. His arms and legs were shackled with thick chains, his mouth gagged with a thick sock, silencing any desperate cry for help. From across the dimly lit room, Jenna's figure was a silhouette against the rising flames that danced and licked at the curtains and furniture. He watched in horrified fascination as she casually tossed a lighter on the ground, the flickering flame igniting a pool of gasoline that spread like a venomous snake across the floor. Jenna returned to the kitchen, her movements deliberate, her face devoid of any emotion. She carried a chocolate cake, adorned with rainbow sprinkles, to the dining table. She sat down before the cake, her eyes reflecting the flames dancing across the walls in a macabre waltz. Her face was a canvas of mixed emotions, a strange blend of sorrow and triumph. A translucent figure of a man and a young girl materialized beside her, their forms shimmering like heat haze. They resembled Andy, her deceased husband, and her daughter, the victims of Richard's callous greed. With a shaky voice, Jenna began to sing Happy Birthday, her melody haunting, her voice trembling with suppressed rage and sorrow. Tears flowed down her cheeks, mingling with the soot and grime that coated her face. As the flames engulfed the house, consuming everything in their path, Jenna continued to sing, her voice fading as she whispered, "I'm sorry," to the spectral figures of her lost loved ones. As the structure collapsed around them, Jenna and Richard were consumed by the flames, their lives paying the ultimate price for sins committed and vengeful hearts. The air filled with a chilling silence, a final, haunting testament to the destructive power of love turned to hate. The once vibrant house was reduced to a smoldering ruin, a silent witness to a tale of betrayal, revenge, and ultimate destruction.